If you are between the ages of 11 and 14, 12 and 14, you will have regular ovulatory cycles, so meaning you ovulate before each period, usually within 2 years. But if you don't get your period until after you're 14, you may not have regular ovulatory cycles for up to 4.5 years.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara. You've got your perky voice on, and I know why.
Yes, I do, because this episode is going to make everyone feel as perky as I do. That doesn't sound exactly right, Vanessa, but it is the episode that we have been waiting for a really long time. We have all sorts of expert voices come into the podcast, for which we are tremendously grateful. And often we just drill down on a very specific topic, or we go really narrow in a corner. And this is the episode that goes broad in the world of hormones. This is an interview with Gillian Goddard, an endocrinologist and a professor of medicine at NYU Grossman School of Medicine, that is going to level set for everyone what peri-puberty means. That is my new favorite phrase. And give you insights. I mean, even Vanessa's jaw dropped during this interview.
So the endocrine system is really complicated and actually deserves so much more research than it gets. And we'll get into that conversation. It's also one we talk a lot about because it has a massive impact on puberty, right? It's like basically what begins and governs a lot of what happens in puberty. And yet there's so much to learn and so much to understand. And Gillian just like blows a million doors wide open. And I know what people are doing. They're sitting there thinking, how is an episode about the endocrine system going to be really exciting? I swear to you, it's fascinating. And we only cover, an nth of the ground we want to cover. So there's more to come on this, but buckle up. If you don't get Gillian's newsletter, Hot Flash, you should subscribe to it on Substack. It's amazing. Her forthcoming book in June is called The Hormone Loop, which totally speaks our language. So buckle up. And I mean that in the most real way. It is a fascinating episode. Gillian, we are very, very excited to have you on the podcast.
I am very, very excited to be here.
So for those of you who follow Emily Oster and Parent Data, that is how we got to Gillian, was through her Hot Flash newsletter, which was originally on Parent Data and is now a standalone big kid newsletter all on its own. And Cara and I have to read a lot of newsletters. We have to read a lot of books. Let's just say there's a lot of skimming that happens. One of the very few things I do not skim, but I read word for word, Gillian, is your newsletter. It is fantastic.
I was going to say we have to read a lot, but we get to read yours.
Oh my gosh, you guys.
That is such a snazzy framing.
Hi, guys. I'm very excited to be here. Fanning over this endocrinologist I'm looking at. Vanessa, you are absolutely right. We don't just read that newsletter. We then get on the phone and discuss.
And we forward it to each other as if we don't know that the other one just read it.
We also forward it to other family members. We're really, So we're launching this conversation with just some level setting for our audience that when it comes to voices of reason, people who give good information that is science-backed, that is clear, that is grammatically correct. That's a big one for me. It comes from you. When we're looking for endocrinology information, you are one of our primary sources. We think you should be other people's primary sources if you're not already. And lo and behold, you have a journalism background, which explains the lack of grammatical errors, which is amazing.
I also have an editor.
Gillian, I want to start... Oh, you do have an editor? Yeah, I do too. Her name is Cara.
I live right here. Yes.
In another life, Cara would have had her own imprint.
Yes. Oh, that's such a good idea.
Yeah, I know. Look at her. She's like all excited. So let's start broad. For longtime listeners of the podcast, they will remember 2 episodes that we did with Louise Greenspan, who is a phenomenal pediatric endocrinologist based in the Bay Area. She wrote the book, The New Puberty. A lot of our data and the basis for a lot of the work we do comes from Louise's work and her ongoing research through Kaiser Permanente. So you're familiar a bit, listener, and yet we've never done a big picture endocrinology episode. And so, Gillian, before we dive into specifics about puberty and endocrinology and growing bodies, can you give us like a big picture understanding of the relationship between endocrinology and the rest of the systems in the body, the endocrine system, and kind of why it's so important when we're thinking about growing kids and puberty?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best way to think about the endocrine system is as a messaging system. And really what it does is send messages that tell all the other systems in the body what to do. And that is why it's so important, because it literally touches everything else, from how we think to how we breathe, how our heart beats, our blood pressure, our gut. Nothing happens in our body without some input from the endocrine system.
And it's not snail mail. It's not slow.
No. Some of it's incredibly speedy, in fact.
And messengers are hormones, correct?
That's right. The messengers are hormones. The glands are what send those messages, and sometimes they're also what receives them. And then all of our various different organs and, blood vessels, everything else are also getting those messages. And the more we learn about the endocrine system, the more we're realizing that different hormones have effects on different body parts that we didn't originally think and didn't necessarily always conceptualize those hormones that way.
This is why the smartest people from medical school went into endocrinology. It's like, they became kidney doctors, they became neurologists, and they became endocrinologists, because it takes a super sophisticated level of thinking, and then it's sort of an ability to be flexible, because there's constantly new information coming in, teaching us how all of these systems are responsive to the world around us. And we can get into, in this conversation, how living in the world we live in is impacting the endocrine system, which is super interesting.
Before we get there, and I know there's going to be a lot of, we're not sure yet, or there's research ongoing and things like that. So we're going to make space for the sort of, I don't know response, or it depends. Do we have a ballpark of how many hormones the body produces and how many glands are involved in the endocrine system?
So we have a better sense of the glands because we know what most of those are. So for people not so familiar, we have a gland in the brain called the hypothalamus, which is part brain, part gland. We have a gland just below the brain called the pituitary gland. And if you want to think about it, it sits straight back behind the bridge of your nose and it hangs just below the brain. And then we have some of the glands that people think of a lot. Ovaries and testes are glands. We have a thyroid gland, a pancreas, parathyroid glands, and adrenal glands. And those are the big players in the endocrine system.
And can glands also be organs? Like, are organs also glands sometimes?
Sometimes that is true. So I think the reproductive organs are sort of classic examples of this. So, ovaries and testes both respond to hormones and make hormones. And my all-time favorite gland, the placenta, which doesn't come up so much in puberty, is also an organ and a gland.
The placenta's a gland?
It makes huge numbers of hormones. And it is the coolest gland, in fact, as far as I'm concerned, but a bit off topic for us today.
Wait, but it's off topic, but come on. It lives in the uterus. So like it's part of the family. Wait, so the placenta in a pregnancy, a body grows a placenta, a gland, and then gives birth to that gland.
That is correct.
It says, thank you for your service. It's a very Marie Kondo situation.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're not going to cover this here, but like one might wonder if there's so much research that could be done on a placenta, right?
Oh, and there is, Vanessa.
Oh, there's tons of research on placentas. They're fascinating.
Oh my God. Okay, our next podcast is going to be called The Placenta is a Gland.
Yes, and in some cultures, they are a meal. Okay.
Yes, no, I know that, which actually makes sense because there's other glands that people do eat besides placenta.
Yes.
Okay.
This is true.
Yes.
Not human, just animal. I just want to,
So let's narrow down to our target demo population of pre-reproductively mature or sort of early reproductively mature tweens and teens, and even let's get into the early 20-somethings who are reproductively mature, and yet they still have this raging endocrine system that has not settled out yet. Can you kind of help us to explain to all of the parents and trusted adults out there, when does puberty begin endocrinologically, and when does it end?
So endocrinologically, puberty begins in people with ovaries and a uterus. You start to see endocrine changes, not physical changes, between the ages of 6 and 8. And in boys, people with testes, you see those changes a little bit later, usually between the ages of 8 and 10.
I feel a viral clip here.
Right. So, Gillian, for new listeners to this podcast who basically their jaws just hit the floor, essentially, if you have read or listened to anything we do, right, the average age for the onset of puberty for girls is between 8 and 9, for boys is 9 and 10. So essentially the clock shifts back 2 years before that for endocrinological. Is that right? Did I say that right?
That's right.
Well done.
For the sort of pre-physical changes, but endocrinological.
Yes. Yeah.
E changes. Changes. I'm just going to say that.
A lot has to happen before you start to see the physical changes of puberty.
Yeah.
A lot of the physical changes, I think it helps to take a step back. Puberty is really sort of two parallel processes. There is adrenarche, which is the maturation of the adrenal system. And then there's gonadarche, which is the weirdest word, but it's a real word. And that is the maturation of the reproductive system. And they happen together and they sort of talk to each other, but they're really separate processes. Adrenarche tends to start first, and it is basically the adrenal glands start to make more cortisol, but they also start to make testosterone. And that is true in boys and girls. And in fact, the adrenal glands are the main source of testosterone in girls and women. And that leads to some of the early physical changes we notice: acne, body hair growth, body odor. Everybody's favorite puberty changes are really adrenarche.
And Gillian, when you say they talk to each other, what do you mean by they talk to each other? Because one of the things we talk a lot about is that adrenarche and puberty are not the same thing. That sexual maturation and adrenarche are two separate processes, but they're related. And we don't go so far down that path because the reason we bring it up is people get very anxious when they see pubic hair or acne or smell body odor on a young kid, younger than they would have expected. And they think, oh, well, puberty starting. So we make that side point. But can you offer up a more sophisticated description?
Adrenarche, one of the things that adrenarche does is increase cortisol levels, which we usually think of high cortisol being bad, but in this case, you need it. The cortisol and testosterone are doing things to sort of prepare the rest of the body to be ready for sexual maturity. And there are, receptors all over the body that these hormones act on. And so that process is important. And that's why it usually precedes sexual maturity. And some kids can have body odor when they're 6 or 7 years old. By the way, body odor is like the least concerning puberty symptom. Some kids are just smelly too.
Yeah.
But you need that process to be taking place physically for the body to be prepared for sexual maturity. In particular, in girls, especially, building up some fat deposition is important. Those types of changes need to happen before the ovaries can start to function.
And it feels important to say, just to interject, that there are kids in whom adrenarche happens later than gonadarche. I mean, it's very possible, especially I see this more in boys and girls, but this is just my own personal experience. I don't know what the data shows, but like you can have boys who are well into puberty and they really don't show signs of adrenarche until late high school.
Yeah, no, I do think it's important, even though there's some crosstalk between these two processes. I do think it's important to realize that they really are separate. They're separate. Usually they're parallel, and usually adrenarche comes first. But as I say often, not everybody's body reads the textbook. So
Cara likes to say that one boob doesn't talk to the other boob.
I really
and
do
one
like to say
testicle
that.
doesn't talk to the other testicle. Like we're not symmetrical.
Yeah, I also like to remind kids that just because they don't have zits all over right now, just buckle up, because somewhere between 85 and 90% of the world gets acne. So you too may be in for your adrenarche side effects a little bit later. But anyways,
my mom said to one of my kids, probably it was around 15, she was like, "Oh, thank God you never got acne." And I was like, I said, "It's coming." Like
was it
just
like
because
the
he
next
hasn't
day,
had it
Vanessa?
yet. Basically, it was like I was like, just
Exactly.
she put like a pox on him. I was like, just because
Literally
he hasn't. I know, totally. Gillian, can you speak for a minute? Because we talk a lot about cortisol, and cortisol is like a very hot topic. Sorry, there's going to be a lot of puns. I can just feel it coming down the pipeline. We talk about in our keynote a lot about elevated levels of cortisol and the risk to kids, both it tipping kids into puberty earlier, but also just like other knock-on effects of living with elevated levels of cortisol over an extended period of time. Can you talk about the ways in which cortisol is not something we should fear, or as you said, is like doing important work in the body that is expected to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that endocrinologists are both much more comfortable with cortisol levels and much more fearful of what can happen when they go awry. We tend to both be much more conservative about thinking about and giving people steroids and raising cortisol levels, and also tend to be very comfortable with the idea that cortisol is 100% something you need. All of us, 100% of us need to be alive. Cortisol does a number of different things for us. At its most basic, it maintains our circadian rhythms. And in fact, this is part of the reason why we see shifts in circadian rhythms in kids in puberty, is because of the shifts in their cortisol levels. Typically, our cortisol levels are highest in the morning. Literally is our natural alarm clock. They drop over the course of the day. In adults, they nadir out around 2 to 3 in the afternoon. In kids, that is a little bit shifted.
Is that why I just want to go take a nap? Okay, got it.
So the entire, every culture in the world has come up with a way to deal with variable with low cortisol levels in the afternoon. If you are in the Latin and Spanish speaking world, you might observe siesta. If you are English, you have afternoon tea. If you're French, you have goûter. And if you're Swedish, you have fika. And all those things involve caffeine and sugar.
Oh,
genius.
Fascinating. Totally. Mine used to involve going to those little frozen yogurt places and with that had the buckets of candy and like getting little bits of candy in a little plastic bag and taking it back to my office. There you go. Now I know.
Can we just do a quick side PSA around the concept of when we supplement these chemical messengers, these hormones with outside sources, sort of what's happening in the body. And just so you don't have to read my mind with the question, here's the scenario we get all the time. I must have been asked this question 4 times this past weekend. Is it bad? I am on a dose, or I have put my child on a dose of, and it's usually some microscopic dose of melatonin. And I or they need it in order to fall asleep. Is it bad? To which I always try to answer probably far less elegantly than you're about to answer. Well, there's bad and then there's bad, and it's probably not bad, but your body has to be able to make these hormones. And if you are telling your body by supplementing these hormones that all is good and they don't have to make anymore, your body's never going to make that hormone. Can you give me a better way of explaining this across all hormones?
Yeah, I think the best way to think about this is to think about all hormones exist in feedback loops. So hormone A is made usually, so it's very easy to think about this in terms of the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. The hypothalamus makes the starting hormone. It's responding to all kinds of things, including the environment. That hormone tells the pituitary to make hormone B. So hypothalamus makes hormone A. The pituitary makes hormone B. Hormone B could have a lot of different targets, including, hormone B might be telling the ovaries to make estrogen and mature an egg, or it might be telling the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. Hormone C, which is the hormone that is made in the actual, like in the last gland in the sequence, so the ovary or the thyroid or what have you, feeds back to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and tells those glands that the body has enough hormones and that they don't need to keep stimulating the gland to make hormone C anymore. There's enough and they can shut off. The problem with taking any sort of chronic hormones is that you're constantly telling the hypothalamus and pituitary gland that they do not need to work. And when you're constantly telling them that, so I think the best example is taking steroids like prednisone or something like that there's lots of different reasons. Doctors give them lots of good reasons. But if you take steroids for more than a couple of days, if you take prednisone for more than a couple of days, not only are you taking doses that are typically higher than what our body would make naturally over the course of a day? Prednisone is a 24-hour medicine. It stays at the same level all day long. And so the brain the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are not getting told that they need to respond to low cortisol levels because they're not feeling those low cortisol levels. And so you can actually really shut down the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. And you can, if you withdraw that steroid suddenly or that, exogenous hormone suddenly, then it takes some time for the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to wake up. This is why when people are on very extended doses of things like prednisone, their doctor also gives them a taper to slowly reduce the dose and get the pituitary and the hypothalamus to wake up again.
I see so many parallels with snowplow parenting right now. I can't even tell you. Okay. That's a great description. So we're going to go to some specific issues that involve the endocrine system. But before we do that, let's just sort of wrap this with a little bow here. So we've talked about hormone cycling. We've talked about different types of hormone loops that are firing at different times. We talked about adrenarche. We've talked about gonadarche, which used to be called pubarche, I think, but now is more gonadarche. And it's like
they both trip off the tongue. It's really,
they really do.
It's excellent branding.
Sounds great. We should run those on a clip. And I think the place to land this overview conversation is sort of that question that I asked earlier about when does it end? What is the difference between sexual maturation and the end of puberty? Because they're different.
Mm-hmm. This is true. I think this is a little bit easier to think about in women and girls because there are outward signs of sexual maturation being complete. And that is with a mature menstrual cycle. And so what do I mean by a mature menstrual cycle? We have different definitions for what is a regular menstrual cycle in peripubescent girls than we do for adult women. And adult women, a regular menstrual cycle is 21 to 35 days, and it varies less than 7 days from the first day of one period to the first day of the next, from one cycle to the next.
And that variation meaning like if it's typically 24-ish days for you, it might be 31 days one cycle. It might be 21 days another cycle, but there's sort of a swing that's narrower than that full 21 to 35.
So when I ask someone if they're having a regular period, sometimes they'll be like, well, my cycle is usually 30 days, but my last cycle was 28 days. That's regular. If they had said my regular cycle is 30 days, but my last cycle was 21 days and the cycle before that was 35 days, that would be irregular.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
In peripubescent girls, they can have on average longer cycles, so longer from the first day of one period to the first day of the next. And they can have more variability, up to 10 or 11 days can be considered normal cycle to cycle variability, meaning that you could have a 31-day cycle and then a 21-day cycle. And so it is really when you settle into that, 28, 30-day cycle with very, very little variability from one cycle to the next, that we consider that you are sexually mature.
And how long after menarche, the first period, do you typically see that? Is it a year? Is it 10 years? Is it like...
It is
help us out.
Hugely variable from one kid to the next. I was having a conversation with some moms recently, and one mother was like, my kid got a period for the first time, and then it's been 4 months and she hasn't had another period, totally within the realm of normal.
Mm-hmm.
The mom next to her was like, my kid surprised us because she got a period and then 28 days later she had another period, and then 28 days after that she had another period. Also totally normal. There is some really interesting data that says that the younger you are when you get your first period, the sooner it will be that your periods become regular, which is it's so
crazy.
Counterintuitive.
And
so
it's
counterintuitive.
What I saw in practice all the time. It is real. Like these kids who are getting their period at 10 and 11, they could set a clock to it within a couple of months. Not all of them, but many of them. And the ones who are getting their period at 14, 15, 16 for the first time, those were the kids who would come back and for sometimes years would say this thing is all over the map. Why?
We don't know the answer to that question, but I also find that data really astounding. What we do know is that if you have your period before the age of 11, you will likely have regular ovulatory cycles within 6 months to a year. If you are between the ages of 11 and 14, 12 and 14, you will have regular ovulatory cycle, so meaning you ovulate before each period, usually within 2 years. But if you don't get your period until after you're 14, you may not have regular ovulatory cycles for up to 4.5 years.
Wow. So, Gillian, that is astounding information, which Cara and I have both seen, anecdotally. It's totally fascinating. When is it time to worry, knowing that it's plotted, right? Like knowing we have the data point, it's being followed and studied. At what point is it concerning? And frankly, is it concerning to parents about the early kids, right? Like, what does it mean that they are getting their periods earlier and are regular more quickly? Is that worrying just as much or not at all in comparison to the 14 plus who are getting it later and, regulating much later?
Because we don't totally understand why this phenomenon occurs, we don't really know whether it makes sense to be worried about these young kids from a long-term health perspective. Certainly, we can be worried about the stress that it puts on a, 9, 10, 11-year-old to be having regular menstrual periods. I mean, I can remember those days, and I certainly would not have wanted to have been dealing with that. And I appreciate that, it's really difficult for those girls. But from a long-term health perspective, we're just starting to maybe get some data that says that there may be some longer-term health consequences of those early periods. But it is really, really hard to parse out that data and say that it is the early period that is causing the long-term health problems, because there is probably something that is different about those girls who get early regular periods that is not their early regular period that is leading to these long-term health outcomes, mostly around cardiovascular disease risk, much like, in midlife and beyond. As for the late bloomers, the challenge there is just more that you're worried about them having enough estrogen, knowing that that a period is really for a young woman, and for all of us actually, until up to a certain point, is really a sign that our bodies are healthy and doing the things that they should be doing. And so you lose that sort of sign. What I always say is, if you start your period and they're not regular after a year, it is reasonable to bring it up to your doctor, to your pediatrician, and see what they have to say. If you have had regular periods, so a period once a month, typically for 6 months, 6 months in a row, with symptoms that suggest ovulation, then at that point, you should expect to go on having periods regularly. And that is also a point at which we would be concerned if you went 6 months having very regular periods, and then after that, at some point, they became irregular.
In a move that would surprise no one, Vanessa, you were reading my mind with your question, and I want to follow up with a second half, which is addressing this movement I've seen on social media with parents who are trying to delay their child's period in the name of health. And I'm trying not to show with my tone how I feel about this move, but can you help poke holes here in what is happening? Because what I'm hearing from you, and frankly, what I have read in every journal article I've ever read, and I've always been taught, is when you get your period, it, with certain exceptions, is not a measure of good health. So can you get into that for a second?
Yeah, there are a ton of different factors that go into when someone will get their first period that don't necessarily have anything to do with your overall health. And the biggest factor in when someone has menarche, when someone has their first period, is genetics. And that's not just genetics from mom. I think with with girls, we tend to get very like female family member focused. Like you get all your genetics from your mom and your mom's mom, but really you get genetics from your dad too. And sometimes those genetics can be harder to parse out. So, you know, if you are the child of early bloomers, you are much more likely to be an early bloomer yourself. And if you are the child of late bloomers, you are much more likely to be a late bloomer yourself.
I want to pause there and just point to a social emotional issue here, which is people who were early bloomers or late bloomers often have very strong feelings about that experience. Often those are not positive feelings for many of them. And as parents, we try to protect our children from the pain that we experienced as young people. And sometimes that's about our physical development, and sometimes that's about social stuff, and sometimes that's about academic stuff. And so, Cara, to get back earlier to your sort of tone, we can empathize with the desire if you were an early bloomer and you're worried about, you know, your own kid going through that and you remember all the pain. This is a point where we would really encourage you to go to your trusted adults, go to your friends.
You adult, go to your trusted adults.
You adult, go to your trusted adult, go to your friends, your therapist, your partner, and give voice to that, because that is really, really real stuff. That is hard stuff. But to have it color the medical choices you make about your kid, not to mention the social emotional choices you make, that's where it's super important for you to deal with your own baggage, you know, as part of this process.
Yeah, yes, and it's confusing because they're entering puberty earlier. And so for people who carry the baggage, especially about being early bloomers, I think that group in particular, now they are seeing kids around them, frankly, many kids who live outside of their home, but maybe they're only noticing the ones who live under their own roof, going through it even earlier. And it's understandable why people conflate these things. So I think it's important to just call out that while puberty is beginning earlier, menarche is not beginning as much earlier as puberty is. It has not accelerated the same way. And Gillian, do you want to just go through a little of that?
Sure. So we're talking about two different ends of the same process, sort of. So the way we measure when a girl enters puberty is by breast bud development. So breast buds are the very first sign of estrogen acting on the body, and they are the most visible sign of puberty.
They're
like, I don't understand why, but there is no hiding a breast bud.
I mean,
they're not very big, but they are very visible.
I try to really take a positive approach to really everything. Like, I'm all on board about making like, breast buds suck. They just suck.
They're grit builders, guys. That's what they are.
They're sensitive. You can't, like, I look at pictures of myself when I was at the stage of having breast buds, and I can't even look at the pictures of myself because I remember the feeling of trying to like smooth them out. I mean, luckily we made the Umbra. But in those days there was no Umbra. And it's just like, and they hurt like hell, and some jerk at recess elbows you and they kill. I mean, they really are a pain in the ass. I'm sorry. Yes,
they are.
Continue.
They are. And that girls are getting breast buds earlier than they have in the past. Puberty is starting, you know, between the age of 8 and 10 on average. And that is, depending on who you talk to, you know, upwards of a year and a half earlier or even more than when girls were entering puberty in the past. Although we talk about this phenomenon as being very recent, but actually this process started in the mid 1800s, at least. I mean, that's when we started measuring it. But the other end of the coin is when a girl gets her first period. And that has only moved about 6 months earlier, from 12 and change to, you know, 11 and a half or so. So puberty has gotten longer, and a lot of that is happening in the very, very early stages of puberty, not necessarily with the latter parts of puberty where we're talking about egg maturation and starting to ovulate and have periods.
So, this is a phenomenon that's true for boys as well. We should just put it out there. It's easier to measure a lot of these things. Yeah. The breast buds stick out of everything. Girls bleed. It's like they're all these tangibles, right?
Yes.
For male puberty, it feels less tangible. Although our entire listening audience knows you can measure the volume of testicles, and there is a tangible objective measurement for the onset of male puberty. But I do think it begs a couple of specific questions in the world of girl puberty before we pull back and go more global. Specifically, is there a connection between the earlier onset of puberty and either irregular menstrual bleeding, heavy periods, these increasing diagnoses of PCOS, endometriosis, like all these hot button issues that we read about and hear about? Is it that the world is becoming more educated about them? And as pediatricians, we're starting to look for things that honestly, we might have looked for occasionally in the past, but now we look for a little bit more? Or are they happening at a more rapid clip or to more people? And if so, is there a connection at all with this sort of shifting timeline?
The $1 million question. So the short answer is we don't know. The long answer is there is probably increased diagnosis, and there is probably more things to diagnose. So we know that women who develop PCOS are much more likely to have had early puberty. And there are some connections between early puberty that are not well sorted out, that are related to both childhood obesity and increasing childhood obesity rates. And also, there's a really fascinating study that looks at the rate at which babies gain weight in the first couple months of life, and that being a risk factor for PCOS in the future. But what I want to point out before people start freaking out about their newborns gaining weight,
to worry about.
No. What I want to point out is that there's been some really interesting data that's come out of my alma mater actually recently about the genetics of PCOS. And in fact, probably what is really going on is that PCOS itself is genetic, but that there are things that are occurring to turn genes on and off that are actually happening even before girls are born in utero. And we're just starting to understand this. This is a whole field of genetics called epigenetics, and I will not pretend to be an expert in that. But there is some great data that suggests that there is a handful of genes that are responsible for creating the right situation for PCOS, and that how those genes get turned on and off, in what combination those genes get turned on and off, probably have a lot to do with how old someone is when they have their first period, and their body composition and their predisposition toward having a larger body, and their likelihood of developing PCOS in the future. And so it's probably more that all those things are connected by this process that's occurring potentially even before babies are born.
And I want to point people to our episode with Karen Tang, who wrote It's Not Hysteria, for a deep dive on PCOS and endometriosis. There's a bunch of topics that we won't have time to cover together today, although hopefully, Gillian, you will come back. But from a gynecological perspective, Karen covers those topics in our episode with her. I want to talk about boys for a minute, because one of the questions we get all the time is, okay, well, if periods are kind of a later point for girls, sexual maturation, what's the equivalent for boys? And we're kind of like, we're not sure, like maybe wet dreams or like mature ejaculation, but we're really not sure, which is not something we have to answer all the time or all that frequently, because usually with the exception of, and we can talk about EDCs in a second. So is there an answer to it that we could now provide people, Gillian?
Help us out.
So I think that, as Cara pointed out, the start of puberty in boys is much more clear. We start to see an increase in the testicular volume. If you've ever seen your doctor, endocrinologists have these lovely things called orchiometers. They look a little bit like something you might decorate your house with, like these like wooden beads. But really what they are is you're supposed to hold one in one hand and hold a testicle in the other and kind of gauge how close they are in size as a way to gauge testicular volume without having to take time to like measure it. Testicular size increases at the start of puberty. Everything beyond that is a little bit of a mystery. And boys' puberty is just not as well documented as girls' puberty is. Obviously, some signs are more related to andrognarchy, and it gets much more difficult to parse out because remember, one of the big things that's going on in andrognarchy is that adrenal glands are making testosterone, but then testes are making testosterone too. And with testes making testosterone, it's a much more gradual upward ascent of sort of like what those, if you drew blood and you measured levels, it's like a gradual increase in the levels of testosterone over time, which is not so true of girls because obviously menstrual cycles, we know estrogen levels vary just from month to month in a way that is not true of boys. I do think that, yes, mature ejaculation might be the best indicator, but it's not necessarily a good one.
It's not, you're not going to be like, here, come in a cup so I can tell if you're like reproductively mature.
So this is the thing, right? Like you're not going to have boys ejaculate.
Listeners, I should have prepared you for that statement. I apologize.
They were prepared if they've ever listened to this podcast before. They knew that was coming.
Right. No so you could do like a semen analysis and see when they have like mature numbers of sperm in their ejaculate, et cetera, but nobody's going to do that.
Right. If you were a betting person, maybe you are, but I don't know. If you were a betting
you
person,
don't strike me as a betting person.
You strike me as like my people who are not betting people. If you were a betting person, what would you bet is going to turn out to be the PCOS equivalent in boys? Because there's got to be some sort of, I mean, with all the data about whether it's endocrine disrupting chemicals, whether it's antibiotics in food, whether it's chronic stress levels and ACEs, it's not just ovaries and adrenal glands that are impacted. Those testicles have to be impacted, right?
Yeah. I think there's two things. I think it's going to be falling fertility rates among men, problems with the, motility and quantity of sperm that men are producing with an ejaculation. And I think it's going to be metabolic syndrome. So one of the things that was really interesting in the study that I just mentioned about the genes for PCOS is, obviously these women who are inheriting these genes that are causing PCOS are, again, not just inheriting them from their mom, they're inheriting them from their dad too. Yeah. And there's a few different things that we see in men who carry these genes, type 2 diabetes, and then obviously earlier in life, pre-diabetes and all kinds of problems with glucose metabolism. All those things are associated with high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and a high risk for cardiovascular disease later in life. And of course, men get cardiovascular disease before women do. Interestingly enough, male pattern baldness is also associated with these genes, which makes sense because there may be an increased production of androgens from the adrenal glands that are affecting the hair follicles and leading to hair loss.
Right. I mean, the running line is always, I have so much testosterone, and that's why I'm losing my hair. But it really, actually, there's a little bit of truth to that.
A little bit.
Maybe a tiny little
It's
dose.
more complicated than that, but it's part of it.
It is more complicated than that. And I am also convinced, on a slightly unrelated note, that in the same way that women have sort of this long path through perimenopause and menopause, I mean, I see it in the men in my life. There is some male equivalent to that as well. And Vanessa's smiling coyly like, yeah, I think I see it too. Like, it is real.
Well,
It
I mean,
is
the minute you
tangible.
say that, Cara, there's going to be like $1 billion devoted to researching that.
Right,
While
only
we all
that,
wait for,
right.
while we all wait for, more research on the 4 million things
I
that
know.
women struggle
I
with.
mean, yeah,
So-
I'm not trying to promote that, but I'm just saying, I think there are parallels across the genders. I think we have made a lot of these issues female, and what they are not issues that are female. They are interesting topics that apply to everyone.
And I mean, I'm going to get political here, but there's a fear of female sexuality and there's an over-sexualization of girls. And so people are busy researching their onset because they're worried about girls being sexual beings. They're a lot less worried about the back end because it means your sexuality or your fertility is a non-issue. So I think the sort of socio-cultural overlay, and they're not worried about boys becoming sexually active people. And so there's less research about sort of quote sexual maturity. So anyways, that's my political statement. Gillian, there's so much more to cover. You have to come back when your book comes out. What is the title of the book that's coming out in June?
The book that I am writing is called The Hormone Loop, and it is all about women's hormonal health from puberty all the way through menopause. And it will be out in June of 2026.
Okay, we'll book you now because it's a hot
We're
topic.
getting to the front of the line.
Yes. And then your newsletter is called The Hot Flash.
The newsletter is called Hot Flash, and it's on Substack. And it also covers topics more than just perimenopause and menopause,
Yes,
although we
it
do
does.
talk about that.
It covers
does.
everything. I'm like, oh my God, I like sidle up with my cup of coffee and dig in. It's the best.
We love it. Strong recommend.
So if listeners, if you have questions on the back of this episode, you heard it here first. Gillian is coming back. So send us your questions. We will start our interview doc now and add all those questions to the interview for next time. You are a treasure trove of information. You explain science so beautifully, so elegantly. I'm freaking out about the placenta still. Like, it's like, I don't know. I feel like Narnia, the closet door has opened now that I know that the placenta is a gland. We can't wait for you to come back, and we so appreciate your being here.
Oh, it's been so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and I would be happy to come back anytime.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.